This is representing the first time we've gone live on time. I think every time we've been late, to the point where we've had people chasing us up for when are you going to be on? And that's not bad considering we have 9 subscribers.
Well, I think that keeping them waiting has its own sort of mystique to it, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You go to a Broadway show that's the curtains at 8. It's never really at 8.
No.
Yeah.
This is the mystique we're trying to build into the show.
Absolutely.
So this week, Darlie Routier, and this is one you introduced to me.
Darlie Routier.
This is one that I am surprised I didn't know about. And I'm really glad you introduced it to me because I went down a rabbit hole and a half reading and just even my wife and I were looking at so many documentaries out there.
Oh, yeah.
And this case has so many talking points, which I'm really looking forward because this is one of the few times where we've been quite good about not really showing our hands on what we think to a degree. And I'm glad that we've done that this week.
Yes. We haven't done that this week. So I'll be curious. You before we started recording, you referred to the idea that you already have developed a theory. I'll be interested to see if your theory does not change as we have an active back and forth discussion.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting to track. But
yes.
I mean, it's certainly a case that it's one of these ones. I think what it's good for, and I had pointed you to the podcast Serial when we were discussing stuff, and that and for anybody who's listening to this, if you're bothering to listen to this, I'm sure you probably know what Serial is, but just in case, it was a long form podcast done by some of the folks associated with This American Life, which is in turn associated with NPR out of Chicago in the United States. And it followed the case of a young kid named Adnan Syed, who was convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, Hai Min Lee. And that podcast wound up being I think they wound up drawing quite a bit of backlash in some senses, but I think people sort of took it for something it wasn't. What it wound up becoming was sort of a meditation, for lack of a better term, on the nature of knowledge, on almost epistemology itself. Like how can anyone know anything? And what is it what is reasonable doubt? What is beyond a reasonable doubt? These are great philosophical questions for a judicial system that depends on these, frankly, somewhat loose concepts. And so, anyway, I think the Darlie Routier case, really falls within that as well. It's a good one because, I tell my students all the time when I teach deconstruction, which is for those of you who may not have heard it, in literary circles, it's a form of literary interpretation. And the notion of deconstruction is that any text, when you start analyzing it, like any good text, worthy of being called literature, when you start analyzing it at its closest level, like if you try to spin one singular meaning and say, like, let's say Shakespeare's Hamlet is about, the nature of indecision and valor and honor, right? Just as a concept, that the more you study it closely, the more that as you attempt to impose a narrative of this is what this play is about, the more you're going to find that actually unwinds. And it can, in fact, even turn out to be almost thematically the opposite of what you originally thought. And so deconstruction, in other words, is just saying that really good texts have so much to them that they tend to break down at the microscopic level so that you can it's hard to pin a single meaning to a great literary text. And the example I use with them, and of course, the guy who developed this notion actually used Franz Kafka's, of all ironic things here, since what we're talking about today, The Trial, as sort of the central piece of what he, as he launched into his own conversation on this. He reproduced a piece of that novel called The Trial. And what I say to my students is that think about what a real trial actually is. It's not about the seeking of truth. The prosecution doesn't really care about the truth. The defense doesn't really care about the truth. It's about presenting competing narratives assembled from the same evidence. And then, basically putting it to a jury and asking them to pick the story that they like.
Yeah. And this case, I think that's a really good, I don't know if you want to call it sort of an analogous story or set of circumstances that you've presented, because that was my impression when I first, I guess from my perspective, forgetting my views on what actually happened. I think I'm amazed as far as how good the narrative was, or how poor the narrative was actually from both sides in such a major case.
Yeah.
And it I think, given the notoriety and given the just the attention that was brought upon this case when it came about, it was just shocking to me, both from the defense and from the prosecution. The state and the defense were just both. It was surprisingly terrible from both sides, which caught me completely off guard. So do you want to, I guess what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into 3 parts. The first part's going to be looking at the story. The second part's going to be breaking down the evidence. And the third part is giving our verdict on the case and what happened. So without going into too much detail. So Dixon, as you were a bit more familiar with the case, or this was something you were familiar with beforehand, do you want to go through sort of the storyline and what happened on the fateful night that the 2 children were murdered by whomever, let's say?
Sure. And I will say, I know you've given yourself quite an education on it at this point. And so in some senses, feel free to chime in, because you may be more familiar even than myself with the case. But it's June the 6th, 1996. It's 2:31 a.m. And the 911 dispatchers in Rowlett, Texas, receive a telephone call from 5801 Eagle Drive, and it's a woman on the end of the line. It's Darlie Routier, and she explains in a fairly hysterical fashion that her home had been broken into, that an intruder had attacked her children, stabbed them, and that her own throat was cut. And please get over here as soon as possible, obviously was the content of the call, though the call itself becomes part of her narrative, because in defense, because she is very hysterical, and she screams quite a bit about the condition of her children, and and whether or not they're going to make it. And she, from one perspective, she seems to show a lot of concern for the children in that call, and that will be important to her defense later.
Do you want to hear the call really quick? I have it ready.
Oh, maybe we should play that call again.
Let's have a quick listen to it. It's 5 minutes long, so we'll listen to just the first, I guess, few minutes of it.
Ma'am?
Can you hear that?
I can.
Who's it? Hang on. Hang on, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm trying to get an ambulance to you. Hang on a minute. What's going on, ma'am?
I'll let this one a little longer.
Oh my God! We get it for 601 Eagle Drive, 501 Eagle Drive. The circuit is on the phone. The child has been saved. Ma'am, I need you to calm down and talk to me. What? 601 Eagle. Ma'am, listen to me. I need you to. Oh my God! Can you take the radio clip? Yes. Oh my God, ma'am. I need you to talk to me.
I'm going to keep playing this, but I haven't listened to the whole thing. I've only listened to snippets, and
I haven't listened to it all the way through either. But you cut it right off before, I think, an interesting part for her defense.
This is what I wanted to get to before we get into that. And for me, it was I heard the call, I think, on a lot of documentaries, and it was a bit. I didn't realize how condensed it was, and how frantic she was in the first you know, what are we at 143, and she's going absolutely batshit crazy, understandably, because her children are in dire straits. But I think I didn't realize how long that went on beforehand, and how incredible a job the 911 operator did given the circumstance.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh,
balls.
Nope.
143.
We
need a
skipped.
producer. We need a
you.
producer.
We do need a producer.
I can't understand you. You guys have to slow down, calm down, and talk to me. What is going on? Somebody's keeping the wall. Sleeping. Me and my little boys are sleeping downstairs. Devon, baby. Devon, look up. I was trying to ran out to the garage. Very nice there. My daughter.
And that's this. I just
Play
want to
that last. Can you play that last before you just that last sentence of that?
Let's get that on.
Just hit play. Yeah. All right, there we go.
And I think that that's a key piece that's going to come up at some point here with her narrative. So in the one, I don't know what you noticed, but for me, I woke up, I was fighting. And I think this piece here is one of the key pieces that's going to come up in a bit when we discuss this case.
Absolutely. It jumps out. The other thing that jumps out to me, other than the fact that, you know, several times she makes reference to that her babies are dying. Oh my God, Jesus Christ, they're dying. You know what I mean? There is some concern, but also the somewhat odd concern that we got to find out who did this, like that her mind jumps there very quickly. I mean, like this is that, you know, it cuts both ways, right? On the one hand, you see the things that would obviously interest the defense, an obvious concern for the welfare of her children. And then if you're the prosecution, that just seems a little out of place, right? That line, like, we got to find out who did this before you even get, you know what I mean? Like that's what she's having. That's where her thoughts are in this crisis moment right now.
And I think when you mentioned crisis moment, I think that makes it really difficult to build a narrative around one way or the other, how a rational person would react in this situation. It's almost impossible to be able to say, this is how a person should react when your children are stabbed and on the floor. And I think that's where it's a little bit difficult.
Absolutely. So should we continue the narrative then, or continue the call?
Should we finish the call here?
All right.
2 minutes in a bit, just because, well, we'll stop it as we go. I think it's probably good we listen to a bunch of this until we get to a point where we feel like we can stop.
Go ahead.
Ma'am, is there with you? Ma'am, is there anybody in the house besides you and your children? My husband, he's just right downstairs. He's helping me, but he's dying. Oh my God. Okay, how many little boys? Is it 2 boys? Okay, listen to me. Calm down. Calm. Go ahead. 501 Eagle Drive, 601 Eagle Drive. It's going to be a stabbing. When are they going to be here? Ma'am, they're on their way. Oh my God. Ma'am, how old are your boys? What? How old are your boys? No. Okay. Oh my God. Oh my God. Calm down, can you? Is your name Darlie? Should I put that down? There's nobody in your head. You don't know who this is?
What I will say is, listening to that, if I knew nothing about this case and I heard that, I would really have a hard time believing she wasn't authentic. You know, the urgency, forgetting everything else with the story, but the urgency, where the cops, the you know, just the intensity. It's really hard to keep up that level of emotion, I would think, if you're acting that way. I've listened to other true crime stories where people are acting like they're you know, in serious, I don't know what the word, you know, in dire straits emotionally. And for me, I heard this and it sounded very plausible to me as far as her emotional reaction.
Yeah, and I am not a trained investigator, but obviously I'm just going by everyday experience and what I would expect to hear out of somebody who found this kind of horror all around them. And I'm hearing what I expect. Someone who's hysterical, someone who just can't even process what's happening. And where are they? Why aren't they here yet? I mean, those would be questions I would expect to hear, and you hear them. So I agree with you. There's nothing immediate in this call that would raise any suspicion for me, except for, like I noted earlier, maybe, just maybe, that little, because before she expresses concern for her kids, there's we got to find out who did this. Like, there's an immediate sort of cast to try to, move suspicion to the third party. That is maybe, but I don't know. I mean, again, I kind of agree with you. It's hard to say what someone might say in a circumstance like this.
Yeah, I agree. I will stop it at a place that I think we both know about. So that was that's going to come into play in a bit as part of, we're going over evidence, but that was a big part of the case. The there's a knife. I picked it up already. And the prosecution made the point, why is she worried about the fingerprints and why is she worried about the knife? What did you think about that?
I get the sense that somewhere along in the investigation, she actually raised the issue of fingerprints. That would tend to make me think a little suspiciously. This does not. You know what I mean? Like, you wake up, there's blood everywhere. You see a knife on the I mean, that's just a natural kind of, like, if you see a sharp knife on the kitchen floor, what do? You pick it up, especially if you have a house with kids. Yeah. Or dogs, or anybody who might, or hell, yourself. You know what I mean? Like, it that wouldn't bother me for even an instant. Basically, she says there's a knife. They're telling her, understandably, don't touch it, and all she hears says is, "Well, I already touched it," which I've
ruined it. I agree with that, and I think this is one of the things the prosecution hammered on a little bit. That why is she so concerned in this moment where her children are dying that she's touched the knife, and it's plausible, whether you agree with it or not. It's plausible that she has concerns about catching this person at some point, and you can argue when that's appropriate. But again, it's really difficult in this situation to know what's appropriate for anybody.
Right.
Exactly. I don't know. Okay, ma'am, listen. There's a police officer. Your front door unlocked? Yes, ma'am. Listen, okay. Very creepy. I was getting here.
So I don't remember that she was asking for the ambulance. Where's the ambulance? Where's the ambulance?
Right.
I didn't remember hearing that.
Okay, is 82 out on Eagle?
So I think we can move on from that. But I didn't listen to that all the way through, like I said, and that call was way more compelling listening to it through right there than it was, I guess, before I'd listened to that.
I hadn't listened to it straight through either, and chopping it up does reduce its effectiveness. And I don't think it was used effectively at trial either, because it's a certain counterpoint to some of the stuff that we'll get to in a few minutes that was used in building the case against her.
Yeah. Well, the police are here. Do you want to pick up where we left off? So we've
absolutely
got, just so I understand, we have just to summarize here. She said she woke up, she was fighting. Somebody stabbed her babies. They ran out the kitchen door, and she's calling for the police, calling for the ambulance. Somebody's there. I'll pass it back to you, sir.
Right. So the police arrive, and first, of course, they clear the house to ensure that there is no one in the house before the paramedics are allowed in. And as I understand it, there is, and I've read different things, but either 3 or 5 minutes it takes from the time of the 911 call, and we just had it up till the time that police and paramedics arrive. I think it's 5 total once you include, because I think the police arrive at about the 3-minute mark, and it takes them another minute and a half. So, but within 5 minutes, the paramedics are inside, and that becomes important later again as a timeline question. So the paramedics are inside. They obviously begin to work on the children, and Routier tells the police, as she mentions, you can hear her say it on the call we just listened to, that the assailant went through the garage. Out in the garage, they did find a screened-in window where the screen had been cut, which would imply, obviously, that someone came into or out of or both through that exit that was created, or entrance that was created. And once they have the children secured and start combing around the scene, obviously there's a tremendous amount of blood evidence in the house. The other thing that in scouring the area looking for this potential intruder, they discover 75 yards away from the house, down an alley, a bloody sock that had the blood of the 2 boys on it, down about 75 yards away from the house. And again, that becomes an important piece of evidence.
And I have actually the map of the sock location versus the actual. So this is their house here. This is the location of the sock. So it's, I think it was 75 yards there. So 150 yards total there and back, the distance, I guess. Yeah.
And so for that night, obviously, Darlie, is wounded herself. That's the other piece. And she would later claim that, she got up, she was awakened presumptively by the fact that she was in some kind of a struggle with the intruder or heard something finally. And when she awoke, she was aware of a man. The one thing that she didn't, here on the 911 call, she says she's fighting, but that fighting is not something that she pushes too hard, really.
No.
It's something that she just kind of generally, so she went towards him. She came after him, and then she saw him retreat. And then she, only after she chased him out of the house, found the knife on the floor, all of that, did she notice that she herself was cut and bleeding. But she had tremendous wounds, and I see you've put the picture up if you guys are watching, for those watching on YouTube. So she had a deep gash in her neck. She had a gash on her arm. The gash on her neck was considered, the prosecution would later try to claim it was superficial. Obviously, the defense response to that was that it was within a 1/16 of an inch of her carotid artery, which obviously, if she had hit, she would have exsanguinated more than likely. She had bruises. I don't know if you have that photo, but her arms are also heavily bruised, her right arm in particular. So she looked a mess. I mean, she did. Although I guess compared to, I guess what's notable about this, if you're being notable, is that the boys were stabbed. She was slashed.
Yeah.
And there is a difference between them
too.
Okay.
So she had, there was a stab mark. So this is a stab mark here. Well, I believe it was advertised as a stab mark. We're going to go into this. Actually, I'm going to save part of the detail of this because I learned a bit about this. It isn't quite what we thought.
Okay.
But there was the way it was, in the report as part of that storyline, she was stabbed here and here. And then on the arm, actually, I don't have a picture of it, but on the arm, she had a gash on her right arm. It was a defensive. Yeah. Up here, you can see the edge of the bandage, a defensive mark that went in just about to the bone. I think it went in about a 1/2 inch. There's not much room between the skin and the bone. Mm-hmm. So it's a stab wound that looked like it was her protecting herself at that stage. And the bruising, which is going to be notable later.
Yes. So really, after they cleared the scene, determined there was no intruder around to be found at that point, found the sock, secured everything. What happened next was they obviously began an investigation. One thing that became a bone of contention was how evidence was handled in this case. This was obviously a smaller police department. Now, the police department one of the things that you can watch on this, and here's a shout out to all my friends in Unsolved Mysteries land. And I post regularly on the Sitcoms Online Unsolved Mysteries message board. And this has been, that segment has been much discussed there.
Yeah.
And the officer says, listen, we're not a bunch of country rubes who just fell off the wagon here.
Yeah,
we know how to investigate and handle evidence. And so, the Routier camp claims that the evidence, it was put into, and I think from, the perspective of a layperson, that evidence was put in brown paper bags and put, stored in a fire station while they, were first clearing the scene. It does sound a little like, I don't know, doesn't sound like 100% professional handling, but at the same time, what do I know? You know what I mean? Like I would say to that,
we have to take their word for it. We have to.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, there's some chain of custody questions there, but pretty quickly, the police focus their investigation on Darlie. They clear the husband relatively quickly. Of course, his story is that the entire time this was going on, he was asleep upstairs with their youngest son, because they did have 3 sons. Yeah. And he was awakened by Darlie's screams. And prior to that, he heard nothing. And that's when he enters the scene, and you hear him enter sort of into the situation in the 911 call. He's cleared pretty quickly as a suspect. The police believe his story. They do not believe Darlie. They start building a case against her. And several days after Damon was to turn Damon was to turn 7.
Yeah.
And I think 3 days after the murders, I think his birthday was June the 9th. And so they, the children were buried, and they wound up having this little birthday party, for lack of a better term, at the grave site. Yes. Which of course became, really one of the key features of this case is video of that ceremony, and specifically the end of it, where Darlie and others, but specifically Darlie, is spraying silly string and acting, certainly when you first see it, I think it makes your eyes pop a little bit that, how is this what she's doing 3 or 4 days after her son has been murdered? It was 8 days, excuse me. The thing was 8 days after, and I think we have the video here.
Yeah, we've been. I've been shit hot today with my special effects. We've had
you are.
While we've been going over it.
What are we going to do when we upload this on the podcast websites? This is an audio medium, we have theater of the mind here.
If you're listening to this on the audio, just to give, let's actually say what it is though. She's had her 2 boys have been stabbed in what is a traumatic event. Mm-hmm. And there is a roughly 90-second clip, maybe less, where they decided, her and her family, I think it was her sister's idea, decided it was Devon. I believe it was Devon, you're saying. He loved silly string. The boys loved to play with silly string. And to celebrate his life and you see it at his actual gravestone. This is 8 days after they were killed, after 8 days after Darlie was attacked with a knife. They're celebrating and spraying silly string all over a bunch of birthday balloons right around his gravesite. And she's smiling. The husband is there looking quite not sure about it, but he's there supporting the family. There's just lots of smiles and happiness. And I think at that point, if I can just sort of jump in, Greg Davis, I remember he's the prosecutor. I saw an interview, and it might have even been on Unsolved Mysteries as well, to the crew, where he said he watched it and he was just, dumbfounded as to how somebody could do that. And at that point, I think he made a decision. This person is guilty based on these events. And this was a central part of the case when we get into the evidentiary side of this. So
I thought you were going to play it. I'm sorry. I was waiting.
No, it is. Sorry. Not the clip. Sorry. I'm not that prepared. So there's certain things I don't have. I don't have any of the interviews because it would have been.
Oh, no. I thought you were going to play a little bit more of the silly string video.
Let's keep it going here.
Yeah.
So this was a massive part of the case.
It certainly was.
And I think the notable point is this was part of a whole day of events that they had. There was a whole prayer day.
Yes.
And actually, one thing that we won't be able to talk about because it never was entered into evidence, the police weren't able to present some evidence they illegally took. They had hidden cameras and hidden microphones at the grave site. And some of the evidence they didn't play was Darlie crying, at her son's grave, sounding absolutely besides herself.
Right. And I've read that as well. And obviously the Routier camp claims that, when you see the entire context, I think one of the things they said was that they invited because the birthday party had been planned and everything had been ready to go. Invitations had been sent out. And so the family made this decision that kids who had purchased things could come and pay their respects and give the present at the grave site.
Yeah.
But they wanted to hold it together. Now I have to say that sounds awfully grim to me. Like I can't imagine, like, what I mean? That's such at the same time though, you can't sit here like, it's hard to parse that because, you could say to yourself, aha, evidence of greedy parents or greedy people who are indifferent to suffering. But these are a bunch of kids who bought some toys for another kid. There's nothing of value in those presents to an adult. So you're not collecting this stuff for it's not some kind of move like, well, we killed grandma and everyone, rich grandma and everyone had a birthday present for her and we still want those presents. So
we're going to sell them on eBay.
Right. Yeah. Like when grandma got run over by a reindeer or whatever, that it's a completely different situation.
Yeah.
So it's not the choice I would make, but again, it's hard to parse. Is that as creepy as it seems, or is that just something that, God only knows what would be going through your mind if you're that beside yourself with grief in that moment?
Yeah. I mean, it is unusual. And it is, I've listened to interviews of people who've lost children and they were disgusted by that. And I also parsed that with the best party I went to I can remember in my life was when my grandfather passed away and we had a wake and we got absolutely shit faced. And it was one of the greatest parties I'd ever been to.
Right.
Now that's a little bit different than 8 days. I think the issue is with the trauma, and I think part of
the issue is with the age of the victim. Like when an old person who's been suffering and has had their life passes away, it's easy to think of the wake as a celebration of life. I mean, there's going to be a sadness, but certainly if I make it to 75, 80, 85, I sure hope anybody who's left behind, pours one out, toasts one up. You know what I mean? Like I don't want. Don't also shed a tear. Please remember that I was a human being, but remember the good times too, right? Having said that, but when it's a small child, I mean, it changes the tone, so in ways that you can't calculate. I actually have been once to a viewing for a 6-year-old child, and there's an experience I don't ever want again.
Yeah. And there's a few ways to look at that because it could be so traumatic that, as it is. And this is going to connect into the whole reasonable doubt piece. It is perfectly feasible that somebody is so traumatized by something that they're blocking out anything negative to do with it and focusing on positive things and trying to stay happy. It's also possible that Darlie is a complete psychopath, but being a psychopath does not mean that you are a murderer. Those two are not mutually exclusive, and that one doesn't prove anything else. So Integrity's back with us. How you doing, my friend? It's unusual, no doubt. I don't know if you can blame someone for doing what they can to try and experience one final positive experience with their child, and that's a fair point. It's unusual though, and it's something that maybe the cops are like, this is something we should maybe keep an eye on, but it's not a reason to put someone on death row, nor is it a reason.
I don't know. No, you'll go ahead.
And nor is it a reason to focus an entire investigation on one person.
I would go one further. I mean, honestly, if I were her attorney, I would be jumping up and down and screaming to keep that video out of the trial. To my eye, and if I were the judge, I never would have allowed it in. It is simply not relevant. You know what I mean? Like it's not relevant. It's not relevant to, the question of whether or not she committed the murders. That has no evidentiary value whatsoever. It doesn't shed any light positively or negatively on her guilt or innocence. It doesn't offer anything. It only is there to make you think, oh, what a bitch. You know what I mean? That's what it's there to do from the prosecution's perspective.
Yeah.
And again,
they saw it 9 times too.
Yeah. And they saw it a bunch of times. And, she, I think, said that she was on some kind of antidepressant or other medication, which wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I would imagine that they gave that to her. And, when you combine that with, I don't know. I find it very, is it weird? Integrity. I agree. It is weird. And you look at it and it's hard for me to imagine doing that. But at the same time, I think, again, as a piece of evidence, it's not evidence. It's
a cause for investigation at
yeah,
best.
absolutely.
And it's, I think the one thing that is extremely notable for later in our conversation is I saw an interview with one of the jurors who made up her mind based on that video. Another juror I listened to an interview for said, I wish I would have seen the rest of the video because I would have gone the other way with it. But it was enough for one of the jurors to say, that was it for me, which, I'm not going to judge the juror. It's not a difficult thing or not an easy thing to do, but it's still notable that video was able to prompt that level of a surety for a jury. What I want to do, because we are going to go into the evidence a bit more. What do you make of the story? So her story, Darlie's story, what do you, not what do you think happened, but what do you think about the plausibility of that story? Because what she did,
I think it's definitely plausible. I mean, like
that's her story. So just to make sure we have the story accurate as to what it is now, she originally said to the police, and in the first interview, she was fighting off the attacker. She was, woke up to somebody attacking her. And then her official story became Devon was leaning on her arm, or no, it was Damon was leaning on her arm. She felt that pressure, woke up and saw a man at the foot of her, at her feet, walking out the kitchen. And that's when she got up, followed him out. There was she heard a glass break. She walked into the kitchen. There was glass on the floor, saw the knife. But that was different to what she said about I was fighting someone off. Her official story is not that.
Right. And that is obviously one of the big things for the prosecution. And it's certainly, obviously the first story is the story that she said on the 911 call is more plausible than the second one.
Yeah.
It does make you wonder, why did she change it? Because honestly, looking at the injuries, it doesn't seem like the injuries that she has, to my way of thinking, do not exclude the possibility that the first version of the story was true. And yet she must have thought that there was something weak about that story, or she was afraid. If you believe she's, let me rephrase that, because if you're the prosecution and if your claim is, or if you're just simply a believer that she's guilty, you have to think, therefore, that she knowingly changed the story because she felt that there was some part of that story she would not be able to maintain when compared to the evidence.
Yeah.
Right. And so the question would be what? And that's an open question. As far as the first story is plausible enough, somebody breaks in, and that happens. I wouldn't say it's common, but it happens. I think what would be, uncommon perhaps is that, if someone's stalking, scouting out, casing someplace, I could see, him casing this house because he's obsessed with Darlie, let's say. But you have to ask yourself a few questions. If you're casing this house, if you've got an obsession with Darlie, if you know that she lives there and this is somebody you're interested in, well, you also know she has a husband and 3 children.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you expect in the first place that your opportunity to go attack her would be limited not by the children, but the fact that she would be in bed with her husband, right? That would be my first thing, that you wouldn't expect to find her on the first floor readily available to be attacked. And then when you get in there, okay, you'd be surprised, presumptively, that the 2 kids were downstairs. Maybe you could say, well, sees the TV on. Maybe he's somehow been stalking long enough to know that Darlie has a habit of staying, I don't know if this is true, but staying downstairs and falling asleep with the television on. So maybe he thinks, I'm going to wait for an opportunity like that. And then is surprised when the children are there. Then I guess he decides to kill the children before taking a serious, attempting a serious attack on Darlie. It's not out of the range of plausibility, but it's also, there's some problems there.
Yeah. And that's a big problem for me, because it is extremely rare, almost, whenever you have somebody who comes in the house to rob or to steal, if they're not connected, it's very rare to have somebody break in and murder people, especially with a knife. A knife is quite an emotive thing to murder somebody with.
Yeah,
especially
a
with
knife that he didn't bring.
Yes. So to go in there and to be so didn't bring a knife. So you have to question whether this person had any intent to murder on the night if he or she didn't bring a knife. So that was for me a bit of a weird one in itself. And I think the other thing that when we get into the evidence of this, the one thing that was notable about the defense is how little they spent time bringing experts in to testify, because there was theories after the fact that, she was that sock that they found, which we are sort of transitioning into the evidence piece. But, she could have been rendered unconscious and then woke up and, or blood loss could have, rendered her a bit confused because she had lost so much blood or whatever the case may be. There's a lot of different things that they didn't even bother to challenge or refute, which tells me that they were worried about really going into this story because it was as weak as it was.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, there wasn't really a lot to back up or refute any part of that story. It was just a weird story, and there wasn't a lot of it was completely circumstantial. There was a lot of shit that went on that looked staged.
Well, right. And I mean, I think that this was the knock against her, right? That her amnesia would be selective. Like she remembered those things that were helpful and had a hard time remembering anything that might pin her down to a specific detail that became falsifiable, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, I don't recall. As long as your answer is, I don't know, I don't recall, I don't remember. The great thing about that answer is it can't be refuted, like, okay, if you say so, right?
And that's what an interrogator would say. And I listened to, I watch body language experts.
Yes, I saw that video. I didn't get a chance to see that. What did they have to say? I'm curious.
So they believe she's a psychopath.
Okay.
And that she's guilty based on her body language. And one of the things they were talking about, sort of on your I don't know piece, what this ex-military interrogator was saying was the worst thing you can say to me as an interrogator is, I don't know. I don't remember. No, that was it. I don't remember, because there's nothing I can do with it. You just don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember. There's nothing else I can do with that. I can't really pick apart any part of that story because you simply don't remember. Therefore, I don't have anything I can reference. And the stuff that she could reference, it was, she did have a consistent story once she nailed it down, but it was just very hard to, I think that was the problem is, who is this random person coming in and why is he stabbing children? And, why is he kind of half-ass stabbing her and then making her run for it? Why isn't he just, oh, there's people here, I need to get out of here? You would think if he went as far as killing, he wouldn't need to run out the door. So the story was weird in itself. And I don't know. I can understand why the police were very suspicious of Darlie early doors.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree too. At the same time, I do think, I have to say, in reviewing and as we go through this, I think you'll see, I was surprised in some senses how thin the prosecution's case really was.
Yeah.
In the sense that it was basically like Darlie's full of, what. Okay. But their evidence for refuting her was, I thought I was expecting a stronger feeling of guilt than I got, going through the trial transcripts and whatnot.
Well, there was one clip, and when I saw this, I thought of, every time I watch this guy speak, the theme from the Dukes of Hazzard kept going through my head.
Okay.
So this was from the Werner Herzog documentary.
Okay.
Routier's case, you are completely convinced that the right person is.
I'm completely,
convicted.
absolutely convinced. There's no doubt in my mind. And you don't know me well enough to know this. If I had any doubt, I would tell you very quickly. But I do not. No doubt.
So uncomfortable.
You look at the sum total. Everything there points to Darlie. There's absolutely nothing that points to anyone else. I had initially some reservation about there were two people in that house. So I was concerned about Darren Routier as well.
This is Darren
I'm
Routier,
not going to get too far into that, but to me, that's a weird statement, because let's take a look at intent. Let's take a look at what is, something that should be investigated. So first of which, Darren, he was dismissed quite quickly. And one thing, I found out reading into this, there was a few things that happened that are notable. One of which Darren had been trying to, which he verified. There was stories of him looking at ways that he can, run an insurance scam and get some money back. And one of those was having somebody break into the house and steal things, and he would set up a U-Haul, and they would take all the stuff, and there would be a great insurance scam. So there was the intent to have somebody come and rob the house, which is just weird enough that we really need to spend a shit ton of time looking into this. There was also stories of, and this is something I heard later down the road as well, that they were having trouble in their marriage to the point where she had threatened to leave. She actually left for one night and packed her bags. And there was a point where he held a gun to his head and said, do you want to make me do this? It was his revolver. And to me, that's just a big red flag in itself. Even if you argue with your significant other, who is the kind of person that's going to pull a gun on their head and threaten to blow their brains out if you leave them? There's a bit of instability there that would make me really think I need to look into Darren a bit more. And just to kind of touch on evidence, Darren had failed a lie detector test where he was asked 4 questions. Do you know who did it? Were you responsible? And I forget what the other few were. So there was a lot of information out there that indicated we really need to look at Darren. And I when he was saying in that video, all evidence points to Darlie. No, it doesn't. All evidence points to, yes, Darlie, but also other options as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem, and I understand because, I mean, Darren, the possibility that he was undercharged or, he wasn't charged with anything and that was incorrect seems to me to be reasonably strong in this case. Having said that, I mean, I assume that part of the issue and the reason why he was cleared quickly is because, like, on the one hand, you look at Darlie and, she's covered in blood and she's been cut and she's got defensive wounds and she looks like she's been in a knife fight, right? Darren did not, except for, I suppose, that he had some blood on his shirt from attempting CPR for the few seconds that he did.
Yeah.
But, the physical evidence just wasn't there, right? That he could come down, stab both of them, and that the fact that Darlie herself did not immediately accuse Darren. So, of course, then that leads to the question, well, did the two of them plot it together? And, was this all like a big stage thing and that, Darren did the stabbing and she was going to call and make the whole thing? Well, then you would have expected that by now, especially since they are now divorced, that story would have broken, right? Because how long are you going to sit on death row knowing that you teamed up with this guy to cover, like, to perpetrate this grandest of schemes?
And he's living somewhere else.
And living fine, presumptively, and you're stuck on literally death row. So, I mean, unless, I guess the only thing is, like, is her pride such that, obviously in order to come clean, she would have to admit that she'd been lying this whole time, that she was to a certain degree involved. And there would be some question as to whether or not that would help her in her current circumstance, because if you're already sentenced to death and you now change your story and admit it,
from the Rowlett Police Department,
they don't have to do anything else. Now they don't have, like, it's been what, 23 years and they have never scheduled an execution date. Doesn't look like they're ever going to either. But if she admits it now, she takes away all their reason.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's the one, like, if I'm trying to chart a course for, like, how did Darren get away with this? He's one lucky bastard. And it's because she knows that she's basically up a creek without a paddle. I would have expected her to roll much earlier, though, because honestly, a jury would probably more likely side with her than him if she started telling the story of, oh, well, my husband's business was failing and he was cooking up all these schemes and he put me up to it and yada, yada, yada. And he did the stabbing and I just pretended, you know what I mean? Like, she probably could have gotten away with that story if that's what she wanted to get away with.
But even then, that's that story in itself. I mean, the stories that they had for Darren, you talk about they were involved in it together, sort of a purposeful intervention.
Right.
The one reason, and this is, to be fair, this is a bit of a knock against Greg Davis, the prosecutor, but this was one of their theories that I heard multiple times, that the children had these $10,000 riders on their insurance.
Yeah.
And
that's garbage. That's garbage.
This was an interesting interview I found.
6 of the trial, we called Officer Main from the Rowlett Police Department. David Main helps us with a motive in this case. by telling the jury what he finds there at the crime scene. One of the things that he finds is insurance policies on the lives of these two boys. We know shortly before these murders occurred that the Routiers go to a local bank and try to obtain a $5,000 loan. And the bank turns them down. Each boy was insured for $5,000. That's one method, one way out of this jam.
I totally discounted that the motive could have been insurance because I had riders on my children. It's something parents do. It's a $5,000 rider.
Is it a coincidence that each boy is insured for the exact same amount of money that the Routiers are trying to obtain in a loan shortly before the murders? I think not.
But do you recall how much the funeral cost for the boys?
I just don't remember the exact amount of that. No, I don't.
It was somewhere between 10 and 12,000.
Yeah. You know, as I said, finance is the motivation here.
Only part of the motivation here. It's okay. So this is not me getting on the soapbox that they're innocent and I'm going to be on the free Darlie bandwagon, but it's just, you know, I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not, working in law enforcement. Neither are you, but I work in communication. And before, he's gray hair now, so it's 20 years on, 15 years on. You have to know that if you go and speak to any reporter with any brain, and you were to, spout out this as a possible motive, you're going to look like a fucking idiot if you're called on it, because that is the dumb, like, you killed two children for insurance that costs less than the money that they spent on the funeral. It's not as if they never, you don't know how, you clearly know how much the funeral costs.
That's an old fact. That fact's been around for years. I mean, prior to that ABC recording, it's mentioned in the Unsolved Mysteries segment. That was recorded in 2002. You know what I mean? Like, I think it was brought out in trial, right? That I think that was the answer to trial, was that the funeral cost, the life insurance. I could be wrong about that, but
now, do you know? And this is interesting because this is something they don't talk about, and this is where we talk about all evidence points to Darlie, yet they don't have a motive. Do you know how much insurance? How much Darlie's life insurance was worth?
You mean Darren?
No, Darlie.
Darlie. No, I mean, I know Darren was worth $800,000. I do not know what
Darlie. I noted this. Darlie, her life insurance policy cashed out at $200,000 to $250,000.
Right. She didn't die.
No. But she was attacked.
Right.
So if she's got defensive wounds and somebody's unsuccessfully tried to kill her, let's argue that we believe that somebody actually did try to catch her or try to murder her.
Mm-hmm.
That would give motive for her husband.
Sure.
And this also links to that sock. So if we go back to, let me find it just so that I'm looking like I'm somebody who can produce something. If we go back to that sock, and I think this may be a good time to transition into, and actually let's wrap up here because I want to transition into the evidence piece. But there was enough information to me that gave more of an evidentiary trail to Darren than that of Darlie.
Interesting. I disagree.
Because I'm not saying that this isn't my view that Darlie is innocent, but if I were investigating this case, there's more motive. So the means, motive, and opportunity. So of course he has the means. He has the motive for the life insurance, and his business is tanking, and he's behind on money. They're trying to get a bunch of loans. His wife is threatening to leave him, which he was. So there's a shit ton of motive where they have no motive for Darlie. An opportunity. Darlie sleeping downstairs with the kids. I'm upstairs.
Right.
Boom.
Well, remember, motive is not an essential element of the crime, right?
No, you don't need motive.
Right. Now, having said that, I disagree, and here's why. And I think this is why he was never treated as a serious suspect. It's because of the phone call, the 911 call. Darlie had the opportunity right then and there, to, if it really was, there's only two possibilities. If it really was Darren did it and it caught Darlie completely off guard. If that's the case, there's absolutely no reason for her to cover him whatsoever. In fact, he's trying to murder you. So you should be calling 911 and saying, my husband is trying to kill me, not weirdo escaped through the garage.
Yeah.
Or, the other option is Darren and Darlie are in it together. So they have to be in on it together, which means that at least they're half right in focusing on Darlie, A. And B, if that's true, if Darlie's facing the death penalty and Darren's, hopping around scot-free, again, as I said before, I think you would have just expected somewhere along in the process, and certainly by now, after they've been divorced for a decade, she would have rolled on him, except perhaps if you believe that, she's recognized that because she's now in a post-conviction setting and the burden of proof is on her, she would have to get a deal cut with the prosecution, who may not be open to it, whereby they would commute her sentence to not death in order to go arrest Darren for the murder. Because otherwise she's admitting to it, and all the blocks to her execution. Because I assume that one of the reasons why she hasn't been executed is because people look at this case, and I think not unjustifiably so, and look at the prosecution's case and say, it's pretty good, but it's not a slam dunk. Reasonable doubt. Has that threshold really been met? I think if I were governor of Texas and I had to sign the death warrant, I would have pause.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I want to go back to your point, though, because I don't think – so can you tell me honestly, given that Darlie couldn't identify the perpetrator, are you saying it's out of the realm of possibility in the state that she was in that Darren got back into the house without her knowing, walked up the stairs, and came back down and acted like he had nothing to do with it?
Ran outside, planted the sock, looped back around the house, came downstairs. I mean, he's the luckiest son of a bitch who ever lived if he got away with that.
Well, the police already accepted that Darlie ran down the street, planted the sock, and came back. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking. I mean, like one of the two of them did that. I grant you that. Yeah.
What I mean is that his wife woke up, failed to recognize it was her own husband who was attacking her, and not only did he get away with that, like basically that she wakes up and doesn't recognize him, but that he's able to go. Anyway. Dump the sock and then get back into the house and somehow get upstairs without her noticing, and then pretend to come downstairs and like discover the whole scene. That's a lucky son of. That's
more plausible than any of the theories they've had for Darlie doing it, in my view. So not more plausible, but I think so are we saying it's impossible that Darlie, in that insanely crazy, freaking out state with their big house, there's no way that he can get back into that house, change, and come downstairs and say what's going on?
Well, I mean, I would have to be a little bit more familiar with the layout. Was there a back staircase? Was there a way for him to get in and get out without being seen?
Why don't we jump into the evidentiary part of it? And for everybody watching this next
week. By the way, part of the problem with your scenario is that if it's true, everything he did from the moment she woke up and made a move towards him, and then he decided to go plant the sock, come back in the house, go upstairs, that was all unplanned. That was an audible that he called in the moment because he thought he'd killed her, or he thought he'd finished the job, or she just woke up and startled him and he changed his mind in the moment and then cooked up this amazing plan that he somehow was able to pull off.
So you're about 3 steps ahead of me. I'm saying that there is enough to warrant an investigation on Darren.
Oh,
he has more means, motive, and opportunity than Darlie does. And for me, one of the things that's notable is, there's a lot of unknowns with this. And with Darren, for me, there's a lot of potential guilt there or involvement. And he wasn't even looked at. And there's a lot of things that the police, the Keystone cops, have deduced that we're working off as our narrative. There's a lot of things we don't know how well they've investigated the series of events that have come to play. So we're working off of the police's timeline. So I think that there is plenty of reason to believe that he would be a person of interest. And it surprises me that he was let off just because a few timeline bits worked out. That was it. Oh yeah, that checks out. We're good enough. We don't.
Did he have any? Did he have any knife wounds or anything to suggest he'd been in any kind of struggle?
No, but neither did. So you would expect for the same thing you were talking about. You would expect that Darlie would have cuts in her hands from stabbing as well. So yes, she was stabbed. She could have stabbed herself, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't necessarily have cut wounds or defensive wounds if he's the aggressor.
Mm.
You know, that I agree with you. I largely agree with you, but I'm just making the point that from an investigator's perspective at that moment in time, with the information they had, Darren is an extremely interesting person to be looking at much
Well,
more
I think they
closely.
did. They did look at him. They just cleared him. But we should probably move on to the.
Well, to everybody watching this. This is the so we're going to be moving on, and I'm trying to do this in bits. So just to let everyone know, if you're watching this live, we're going to have this available on Twitch, on Facebook, on Twitter, and then we're going to be airing these in part 1, 2, and 3. So part 1, this is the story. Part 2, join us for the evidence, which we are going to be talking about next. And let's talk about the evidence. So we're talking about the bloody sock. The thing I find interesting about the bloody sock. So I'm gonna not change, but I'm gonna update my view here. So the one thing that I could see happening here is this is Darren's sock. This is Darren's tube sock.
Right.
And I heard somebody mention this, and this really makes sense to me. This sock, forgetting how it got there, was used to move evidence around because it looks like somebody put their hand in it and there's finger marks here as if they were holding something in the sock to not get fingerprints on a knife or something to that effect.
Sure.
And how it got out here is another question. But for me, the sock, you know, to think that Darlie had any opportunity to put that there. Did you hear about the timeline that one of the investigators for Darlie Routier put together for when, and this was a doctor as well. I think I actually have a statement from him. But
right, well, it has to do with the death of the son, right? And he had
Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner in San Antonio and editor-in-chief of the prestigious Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, testified that her injuries. Wrong thing. I'm an asshole. Records indicate that Darlie was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher for 5 minutes and 44 seconds. Just as that call was ending, a police officer came inside the house, and he was there for at least a minute before the paramedics arrived. The paramedics found Damon still breathing. He died shortly thereafter. Why is that important? According to a doctor who studied the severity and location of Damon's stab wounds, the boy could not have lived longer than 9 minutes once he was first stabbed, and probably lived no more than 6 minutes. Let's assume he lived 9. If you subtract that 9 minutes from her 5 minute 44 second phone call to 911, then subtract the additional minute and 10 seconds that she was in the presence of the police officer, Darlie had only 2 minutes and 6 seconds to stab her sons, head for the garage, step through the slit in the window screen, jump a back fence or go through the back gate, run barefoot for 75 yards down an alley, drop a bloody sock, run 75 yards back, stab herself, clean up the blood around the sink, and that was another thing we'll talk about in a bit, and stage whatever crime scene there was left to be staged, boy's blood on the back of the nightgown. So for me, that's not quite disqualifying, but it's close to disqualifying Darlie from putting that sock there. And we have to ask, how did that sock get there?
Sure. And I mean, the sock definitely presents a problem. It was clever if Darlie did it. It was diabolical if Darren did it. And if there was an intruder, it's a little odd because here's an intruder who shows up to not to rob, clearly wants to murder at least somebody, but doesn't bring anything for that purpose. And you're thinking, well, okay, let's say he is there to rob. Let's say he's there to break in and steal stuff. And then he realizes, oh crap, there's all these people here and I'm going to get caught. So I have no choice but to murder the lot of them. Does he think about the socks? He's grabbing the knife. Is that just a panic move? You just grab the knife and start stabbing? Why would he also think about the sock? I mean, it doesn't really fit with an intruder at all. I don't think, that you bring, so it's got to be Darlie or Darren who planted that sock. So now you're down to, well, which one of them was it? And although I agree the timeline is tight, that narrative that was just laid out, I think is a little goofy in that I don't see why she certainly, if we're assuming that she's responsible, she cut the hole in the screen. Why would you assume she actually used it? She'd probably just use the door. You know what I mean? Like that's just a staging item. Yeah.
She's not she's not an intelligent individual. I think she's gotten a bit street smart in her older age. If you listen to interviews more recently, but when you listen to her in interviews, She's not a bright young person. She's not somebody who's very world wise. And to be able, like you said, diabolical would be the word to use if she was able to pull that off. And one of the things that jumped out to my wife when she was watching the Werner Herzog documentary, the first responder who wasn't supposed to be there, he was in the area, noted that Darren was running out of the house. So, was this his second run out for whatever reason? Why was he leaving the house? So that there was an element where he was seen outside of the house at one point. I'm not saying that was him coming back. He wasn't coming back. He was coming out of the house. But while she was on the phone, he was in and out.
I mean, running out to meet the paramedics who are coming to get your children.
They weren't there yet.
I know, but like you've called, you're waiting, running outside to see, are they here? Because you've determined there isn't anything you can do. I don't know. That strikes me as within.
Yeah, it is completely within. But we have to ask how the sock got there, and if we're putting this solely on Darlie, and that timeline has to be met by somebody who is not a mental titan. We then have to start to ask the question, how does that get there? And for me, this is where we start to disqualify death penalty Darlie, when we start looking at the evidence out there that sort of discounts her as being a sole actor in this.
But I mean, the problem I have with any Darren is involved theory is the possibility that Darren is solely involved strikes me as minimal, de minimis, just because of the fact that Darlie made the call and Darlie didn't identify him. And it would require him, as I said in the last segment, to change, if he's responsible for this, first of all, why would he kill his children? Wouldn't he kill his wife? And the same question that Darlie's defense asks on behalf of Darlie, if she's after insurance money, why wouldn't she kill her husband and for the $800,000 instead of her two children for 10?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask the same question for Darren. Like if he's after insurance money, why not kill the wife for the $250 instead of two kids for 10? So I don't see his motive here. And then, I certainly do see him. You're right, but he attacks her, but in a comparatively speaking, haphazard, half-assed way, gets caught in the middle of it. If you believe that he's the sole person, is the luckiest SOB that she, in waking up and being alert enough eventually to pick up the phone and call 911, not recognize that it was her husband who was in fact attacking her. And then he somehow has either a house that permits it or just, real stealthy way about him that he can not only re-enter the house, but apparently get back upstairs and then appear to come down the stairs. Although maybe that's a bit much because maybe Darlie doesn't really know from which direction he came. I don't know. It seems to me to be very, very unlikely. So you're down to, well, Darlie and Darren work together. But if that's the case, again, why hasn't Darlie rolled on Darren?
Well, and this is, and I agree with this because one of the theories, and this isn't my number one theory, but one of the theories that I looked at quite closely was having another actor in there because, again, Darren had motive, and you could convince somebody to help you kill your wife for $100,000
money. Yeah, sure.
Split the insurance money, and it's if that person got away, Darren's not going to rat out his mate because his mate was quite happy to murder his wife. What's to say he isn't going to come back and murder him?
True.
But there's reason to think that there was somebody else involved in that, and that's something that wasn't looked at. And I think there was evidence in the case that there was multiple people. There's somebody who lived about a block away, or was about a block and a half away, who reported somebody in all black trying to get into the house. Now, it was also notable, and I didn't mention this earlier, that the drive, he was having problems with his Jaguar, his car. And the drive had no cars on it. So it looked like the house was empty when somebody entered. So it is feasible that the person who tried to break into the house, and the police took the statement, they took the evidence, and they didn't follow it up. But there was somebody a couple blocks away breaking in at about the time, or about 10 minutes or a half hour before somebody broke into Darlie Routier's house. There was also people that reported a strange car hovering around the area as well, even pulling up in front of the Routier residence. And that wasn't really looked into any further. So there's, again, more evidence to say there's not more evidence to say Darlie didn't do it, but there's more evidence to say that this is bigger than just a wife, a mother turning on her children and going batshit crazy.
Right.
Somebody who had no priors, somebody who had no notable mental health conditions outside of depression, which we'll go into that in a bit more.
Well, I mean, if we're analyzing evidence, I'll say that the two pieces of evidence that I find most compelling in opposite directions, really the sock. I think that the sock is anything. If anything, it points to somebody in the house, but it's not the be all end all, right? It could go either way. What I find the two most compelling are, and certainly what I think sank her battleship with the prosecution and a trial, was that on one of the other knives in the kitchen, they found traces of the screen that had been cut out.
Yeah.
Now that's there isn't a good explanation for that other than somebody in that house did that.
There was a forensics expert who did say, so this is somebody working on the appellate team, who said that same material was used, that same compounds. So what the investigator said. Now, this is something that would have to be submitted to evidence, and I'm not saying that this is 100% accurate, but they had a forensic expert who said that the material used on the fingerprint brushes is identical to the same material on the screen. And the material they found that matched the compound on the screen was the width of a hair or the width of a brush. And they found this material after it had already been brushed for fingerprints. So you could arguably have somebody from the defense team say, okay, is it feasible that this is also from the fingerprint brush? If the answer is yes, then that brings into question that evidence of the screen.
Well, that's good. I hadn't heard that. That's interesting. I hadn't read that.
The one that Darlie's mother has one point, which I don't buy. It was a butter knife, and I don't have a picture of the knife, but it was a rounded end. It was a big bread knife, I guess. I don't know why she calls it a butter knife. They had money, so maybe rich people have different butter knives than I do. But it was a big rounded. It had a rounded edge, and she said you couldn't get that knife into the screen. And I grew up in the States, and I've put my fair share of things through screens, and you can get pretty much anything through a screen if you push.
Oh yeah.
With an edge, but that was her reason. So there was the ability, and there is the ability currently to counter the material that it isn't necessarily from the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't find as compelling, although I don't think is easily dismissible either, the fact that the area around the screen that was cut out, that was supposedly the point of entry and exit for this intruder, the windowsill underneath it the dust wasn't disturbed. The mulch outside that window there was no footprint or any sign of disturbing. You know what I mean? Like the entry in, entry out point. I don't think that's I don't know if that would put it over a reasonable doubt threshold for me, but it makes me go, in terms of whether or not someone actually did use that point as a way in or out of that house that day.
I didn't get a picture. I have a picture of that I can bring up because that was something I thought about. But Darren, I saw a video of Darren actually showing the window. And it was weird that the police said that there was no footprints, therefore it's not possible. If you look at a picture of the window, it's actually really hard to make a footprint in the dirt because the concrete is under the window and it's very easy to step in and step out. And he demonstrated it. It would actually be difficult because the windowsill was only this high off the ground, and it was almost like almost like a 5 foot tall window,
right?
About 3.5 feet wide. And he had the window open, and he said it was easier just to step in and out without touching anything, without disturbing anything.
Sure.
So there was concrete under that. I thought I had a picture. Let me just try to.
Also, I thought there was an unidentified fingerprint actually found in that windowsill.
So that let me share this one with you so you can see the window here. So this is the window in question.
I've seen this window.
Yeah, the fingerprint there. That was the other thing that I read about, which that was interesting because this is something that's being contended, and what the prosecution says, rightfully, what Greg Davis will say is they're making these claims about a fingerprint, but they haven't produced this evidence, and they've had this fingerprint for years. Now they've had forensic experts that have said this fingerprint. They've had 3 forensic experts who have now said, might be 3 or 4, that this fingerprint can be matched. There's enough data points to match it. However, and none of those prints match Darlie, Damon, Devon, or Darren, all the D's. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that. Ooh, that's awful. Why would you do that? And with that inability to match them, they've not been given permission to run that print or those 6 points that they've been able to get through the national database. So they're still trying to get that fingerprint cross-reference. I don't know if that's changed. I don't think it has. I find it interesting that they haven't been able to at least check that fingerprint.
Yeah, I mean, I would turn that over immediately if I thought I had something, right? So that is sort of an interesting. If it's so exculpatory, why haven't you turned it over?
Yeah. What I find interesting, which I think is compelling, is the sink. So I don't know if you're familiar with the sink, what was going on with the sink.
Refresh the memory of myself and the audience.
When they came back in, the sink.
Because I'm going to blame the audience for my lack of knowledge. It's the audience you're telling, Sean, not me.
That's right. So audience, when a chemical luminol was sprayed around the kitchen to reveal traces of blood not visible to the naked eye, blood stains were discovered in the sink, the kind that would be consistent with someone washing blood off his or her hands. There was also an indication that some of Darlie's blood around the sink had been wiped up with a towel. So there's you start getting back into that cover up piece, and there was another piece of evidence that kind of went towards there was a cover up in the house, and that had to do with the wine glass. Now, the wine glass, there was a few points with the wine glass, one of which they were talking about the wine glass being on top of the blood, but the wine glass not having blood on it. So it's feasible that somebody in knocked it on the floor when they were coming in and out of the scene to take care of the kids or whatever. But one of the things they said was it was knocked on the floor, and the way this wine rack is set up, it's not easy to knock. I think you have to actually unclasp it up here and pull it out. So you can't just knock wine out of that wine glass out of that rack. So you would have had to have physically grabbed it and thrown it on the floor. Which the whole idea that there was a piece of glass on the floor that wasn't prompted by any sort of scuffle or anything like that is weird. And to me, it looks like there's some sort of a cover up there.
Yeah. Yeah. And the wine glass bothers me. The sink actually bothers me quite a bit as well, because there isn't any good reason, especially once again, the problem is that she gave enough of a story. That's always the problem with giving a story, is that now you have some things that are points of verification.
Yeah.
Her story makes it clear that he exited the house without attempting a cleanup. So there shouldn't have been any blood in the sink.
Yeah. I'm just going to go through some of the other evidence here in case some of the audience has heard and some of the audience hasn't heard.
I know the one that I think is the most important for her, not so much for her innocence, but the one that I question the most. Go on.
Well, let's go to the list here. I have the bruising on her arms.
Yes. Which I think that helps her.
Well, this is actually the biggest part of contention that may hurt her, because every medical expert who saw her on the day, everyone testified that they had no markings and no bruising on her arms. And the picture that we're looking at, so let me bring up the original picture here so we can look at it in context. It is understood by the medical professionals who treated her that this would have happened after her visit to the hospital. So this bruising, how deep this blood collection is, you would have seen evidence of this. And all the nurses and doctors who saw her at the hospital, they said that they would have seen some evidence of something, and there was nothing there. They documented nothing. So the medical experts who saw her believe this happened after she was in the hospital.
Oh, who took these pictures? I always I saw them and I took them at face value. Silly me.
So the photos were taken after she returned from the hospital, and the only people who have ever maintained that this happened on the night were her family and friends. Who
took the photos?
I think that it looks like the police took them after the fact, because she was arrested after the fact, so she would have had these bruised arms. I'm not 100% because it looks like this is state's exhibit, so this is evidence. So this may have been taken after the fact, and bruising like that would take a good week to go to minimize. I mean, that's
at least that's
hideous. Yeah. So that's something that actually goes against her in my view. That bruising showing up after the fact and her showing that bruising off.
When did she have the opportunity? I mean, because that kind of bruising is not easy to produce.
Well, she was home on her own. Not on her own, but she once she left the hospital, she wasn't arrested until. Well, it would have been at least 8 days after 8. It was she got arrested the day after the silly string
event. So it's 9 days later, right?
So 9 days later. So she had plenty of time to.
She's being surveilled, though, probably during that time. Yeah, but I guess she's home alone. Yeah, she's inside.
Well, let's look at it this way. This puts into context the injury she sustained, and there's a few different things. So let's take a look at the injuries, because there's a few different things on these injuries here that are of note that I read about. And I actually have some comments from the medical examiner about this. Let me just see here. Where is it? So few points here. So Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner in San Antonio, so this is what I was reading earlier, like an idiot, testified that her injuries were not at all consistent with self-inflicted wounds we had seen in the past. So this isn't the medical professionals who had seen her. And he said the cut across her throat was hardly superficial. Now, that being said, the cut across her throat, the people that treated her said that, yeah, it was a couple millimeters from her artery, but it was only like, it wasn't that deep. It was only like a half an inch deep. They also talked about this cut here. They said it wasn't a stab. It was more of a laceration, almost as if somebody just broke the skin, and it was like not very deep. The only one that was deep was the one on her forearm that was down to the bone. But if you think about where your bone is here,
it's not that deep.
Not that deep. And it would have been hard to stab her in the forearm, not that deep. And the reason I bring this up is this is interesting in comparison to this photo, if we can prove that that is after the fact. So if she's willing to do this to herself, she sure as shit would be willing to do this to herself or with somebody's help. So to me, that paints an interesting picture.
It does. And I apologize that I did not know this about that. I always just saw those photos of the, and when I was researching, I never really questioned or thought to look into those, the bruised arm photos. I've learned something here. I just assumed that those were police photos and were, part of their investigation really that night. Or, well, maybe not that night, because obviously she went to the hospital first, but, photos taken in the aftermath. And of course, bruising does take a little bit to develop. So you wouldn't necessarily expect, like, that bruising looks like it's a little bit old, in the sense that it wouldn't have been something that would have developed in the first 30 seconds. You know what I mean? Like, I got blood drawn, for example, on the weekend or on Monday. And today I noticed I have some bruising around it, but it wasn't there even Wednesday or Thursday.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it because the so I'm just going to find it here. Where is it? There was every single across the board. I think one of the conclusions. So that woman on Unsolved Mysteries, I think her name was Barbara Davis. I actually found there's a website you can look up, Darlie Routier Fact and Fiction. She spent a lot of time researching this. No, it's not on here. But one of the things that she did come up with was, every medical professional that saw her said, now this is something I have to go with what those medical professionals said. That level of bruising, there would be some sort of welts or redness or some sort of indication. So if you think about when you get in a fight and you get a black eye.
Right.
So I think what they said was the bruising would have been consistent, would have shown up within 24 hours, and she was in the hospital I think the first 2 days, and they said we would have seen signs of it before she left the hospital.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's something that is arguable, but that's one of the points. And there isn't much else in the way of evidence. Is there anything else? Well,
that's the big one. I guess maybe it's maybe become, maybe something that's no longer really part of the prosecution's narrative, but one big part of the prosecution's narrative at trial, surely was this Tom Bevel character. Have you read about this?
Yeah, actually. Let me just find it, because
he's the one who testified, and Tom Bevel is one of these cast-off study people, blood cast-off and cast-off, right? And he was somebody who famously ran around testifying against all kinds of people and, studying the blood cast-off and using, studying, looking into the sheep's bladders and divining what happened from blood cast-off. And he said there was, even like, it's great. I wish I had it here. The Unsolved Mysteries segment shows you the single spot of blood and it was, I think, an admixture of the two children on the back shoulder, sort of behind. And his contention was that's from, you're making a downward stabbing motion, you're pulling the knife back, and a blood drop hits you right here, and that's that cast off, right? So that the problem is that this Tom Bevel guy has subsequently been thoroughly embarrassed and debunked as somebody who has made a number of overinterpreted. I don't even know that he was doing it. I haven't looked into it enough to know what was he truly like, malevolent? Was he outright lying, or is he just, testifying more aggressively than his actual expertise warranted. But like there was an example of a case where he testified that somebody's cast off blood in another case was, this is clear cut evidence that this so and so did this thing, and in fact, that person was later exonerated, not just not on a technicality, exonerated by DNA evidence. So, and in general, blood cast off. There's a great article out there about cast off, because if you watch a lot of forensic files, it comes up so frequently. The blood cast off analysis, blood spatter analysis. That's what it's really called. Blood spatter analysis is used to determine angles and velocities and where someone was standing when this, that, or the other thing happened. And a lot of that so-called science turns out not to be science, and in fact is really questionable. And so it's now starting to be questioned. The article is called "How a Dubious Forensic Science Spread Like a Virus." For those looking for those of you trying to find the article I'm referring to on Google. Herbert McDonald, Donald is not the author, but he's somebody he's the guy who launched modern bloodstain pattern analysis, persuading judge after judge of its reliability. He trained lots of people, and this article was published December 13th, 2018 by a woman named Leora Smith. So good job, Leora. But that's science that could be close to junk science. You know what I mean? It's like bite mark analysis also has really come into some significant scrutiny. So in terms of like their prosecution's presentation, they're basically presenting the idea that this blood from Darren and from not Darren, I'm sorry, Devon and from Damon winding up on the back of her shirt where it did is practically, the damning in and of itself. Like, how else could it get there?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is, first of all, if she's being stabbed with the same knife by someone else, easily, you know what I mean? I would think would be the answer,
It reeks of somebody, and it does. It just reeks of somebody who's like just sort of making it up as they go.
Yeah.
The blood evidence was quite important. I think the thing they took away from the blood evidence was they didn't find anybody else's blood on the scene, which again goes back to every time I see a stabbing to the degree that these children were stabbed. I mean, it was forceful. There was no blood evidence from anybody else. The one thing that I'm not sure how to take, if she was cut to the across the throat, and so there's another sort of contradiction here, but if she was cut in the throat and stabbed as she was, there was little to no blood on the sofa, and that's what this is. This is the sofa that she was laying on when she says she was attacked. There was only a couple of droplets on the pillow. There wasn't much in the way of any blood, and I actually have the pillow as well. And I think these are the spots of blood for somebody who was laying down on their back and attacked, had their throat cut, stabbed arm. It makes me ask questions. Why isn't there more blood on the sofa for somebody who's been attacked, to the degree that she was attacked? And that kind of doubles back to the fact that the medical professionals who looked at it actually weren't as damning about the injuries as, let's say, the family and some of the Darlie's experts. They were saying that actually a lot of these wounds are surface wounds. Even though it was 2 millimeters from the artery, it doesn't mean that it was a particularly deep wound. So it doesn't necessarily tell the story of somebody who was aggressively attacked and there was an attempted murder there.
Right.
But it is very much Keystone Cops. And what I find disappointing in all of this isn't so much how poor the prosecution was, but how poor the defense was, and how, when we take a look at witnesses, they didn't put a lot of witnesses up to contend the experts of the state. And the jury themselves, one of the jurors said, we really didn't get anybody telling us, that this information we were getting was wrong. The state was saying, here's our expert and here's why it proves Darlie did it. They never put anybody up to the stand because the defense thought, oh, this is circumstantial. Texas isn't going to fry somebody on circumstantial evidence. Clearly hasn't lived in Texas long enough.
They'll fry as soon as look at you there.
So the evidence in itself, it's weird. There's not a lot of evidence, and that really sort of points into a very specific direction. If anything, it highlights the fact that the police didn't really do a very thorough job in coming to the conclusions that they came to. Would you agree with that?
Well, you're being very critical of the police here. I don't know that I do entirely, in that I mean, they collected what was there. I'm not sure what else they were supposed to have. I mean, they interpreted the evidence one way. Now, you can say that they had tunnel vision, but sometimes you have tunnel vision because it's obvious who did it from the word go, O.J. Simpson. And so, you know what I mean? Like, sometimes the tunnel vision is there for very good reason. Now, I don't know if that's the case in this case, and I think we'll talk about that in our next segment. But, I mean, part of what my understanding is part of the police's initial suspicion of Darlie's entire story was that there's all this blood all over the place in the living room and the kitchen. It's a very, very bloody scene. Obviously, I mean, people are being stabbed with a knife, so of course. And yet she says that the guy escapes through the garage, and there was no real blood evidence of any significant value in that garage, any trail leading away from the house through the garage. And that was problematic for them. Now, I have this feeling, again, I'm not a professional crime investigator, so I'm speaking from ignorance here, but I don't know if I'm an outside perpetrator and I've stabbed a bunch of people and now I'm fleeing the scene and I've dropped the weapon. I don't know how much of a blood trail I would necessarily leave. Like, I don't know. I mean, like, it seems to me like they're arguing from absence there. In other words, that the absence of evidence is evidence. And I'm always suspicious of that argument. Having said that, I understand why it certainly raised red flags. And I think the preponderance of the evidence, and this is Darlie's problem, is that other than her claim that someone broke in, there really isn't much evidence that there was anyone else there. Now, there are these couple of fingerprint issues, but again, the fingerprints have not been submitted. They exist because Darlie's family says they exist, but until there's something more concrete than that, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, and that's problematic. I do think, though, and why don't we let's move on from the evidence section here, and to everybody watching, this is the end of part 2. Again, if you want to watch us live, watch us on Twitter and Twitch, and as far as to watch the whole broadcast, and we'll be releasing part 3, which after the evidence bit, part 3 will be our review and verdict on what we think happened and our verdict on the case itself. So let's move on to that, because I think we both probably agree. It sounds like that there's no way that she should be on death row right now, regardless of her guilt or innocence.
No, I agree. And of course, I'm not one for the death penalty anyway. And honestly, I think you haven't lived here in a bit, and it seems like even in the United States, it's slowing down. People's jumping up and down for it. The rates, Pennsylvania hasn't executed anybody in 30 some odd years.
Yeah.
Even in places where it's more popular, there's been a general drift towards, the problem is it's a solution that cannot be undone, and enough people have been exonerated over the years and things like that has made it politically less popular. And funny thing in a sense, because of DNA, you can be more certain today in some senses than ever before of a particular person's guilt or innocence in a particular case. But having said all that, I don't think, this is one of those deals where as I understand it, in Scotland, there is, 3 options for a jury. There's guilty, there's not guilty, and there's not proven.
Yeah.
This to me is always one of those cases where I'm between guilty and not proven. You know what I mean? I don't think I would want to, if I were on a jury, I'd want to vote to acquit. But I also have a strong feeling, first of all, that evidence that was submitted, particularly the silly string video, and also the prosecution spent a lot of time convincing a conservative rural Texas jury that Darlie Routier was basically, your classic Jezebel woman of the world. They asked her a bunch of questions in the trial about the level of her participation in her husband's business. They examined her defense, even has her examining her journal. And her journal, frankly, I don't think has anything in it that really is particularly damning, but it certainly opened the door for the prosecution to talk about, she did at one point seem to be indicating an interest in potentially harming herself in the months leading up to the murders. And so they're trying to paint her as depressed, worldly, somebody who's interested in material possessions, isn't a traditional house mom in the sense that she's participating in the business. I mean, they're trying to paint this very negative picture of her character, which is all completely irrelevant, in terms of what matters is, and I think this is something about the world having changed. In 1998, that's the way this type of evidence would have been presented. Today, I think they would have been hammering much more on whatever physical evidence they had. The problem is, as you've pointed out, and I think correctly, while the physical evidence is very, very, very suggestive, I don't know that they have the smoking gun in and among it.
Yeah. And that, for me, I look at these, I'm quite liberal with my view on these. And in my view, whether I'm suspicious she did it or not, the burden of proof has not been met at all. Mm-hmm. And we can make an assumption. And my general view is I'd rather somebody who may have gotten away, somebody who may have done it, get away with it if you have no evidence to confirm they've done it.
Yeah.
For me, it's a no-brainer. It's people. Well, what if they get away with it? Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. People who commit murders and get away with it, it's because you haven't been able to prove it. That's life, and that's shit. But for me, the fact that she was even to go to that next step and to have the balls to convict her of a crime that's worthy of death on solely circumstantial evidence, and for all of their the evidence that they claim they have and how assured the prosecutor is. If I were to hold a gun up to his head and say, is she innocent or is she guilty? He would hesitate. And that's enough for me to say, okay, well, clearly this isn't a death penalty case. This isn't somebody who should be, in the position they're in. And I have been hard on the police in this one because I'm just amazed at all of the leads that they confirm that they didn't go down. It's not as if I'm saying anything that's controversial or anything that isn't backed up by the files, the police's sort of files and their rendition of what happened. They didn't investigate anything else outside of Darlie, and they only have circumstantial evidence. There may have been something else out there, but they didn't go down those rabbit holes. They didn't chase up. They spent more time trying to prove Darlie did it than disprove or prove what happened. And that's problematic. But there was one thing that I noted, and you mentioned the depression. That depression is key, is in my view 100% key in what's happened here, because I think, and what I'll do is let me go into what I think happened, because I have a theory.
All right,
and I'm going to share what my theory is, and let me hear what you think about it. But
okay,
it was confirmed she had postpartum depression, and this, she even wrote a suicide note at one point. Now, I think, and I did some Googling on postpartum depression, and I came across an article in The Atlantic called Postpartum Psychosis. Have you heard of this?
No.
So postpartum psychosis, I'm just going to read a bit from it. Sorry, I'm just bringing it up here. So medical research estimate that untreated postpartum psychosis leads to an estimated 4% risk of infanticide and 5% risk of suicide. So with postpartum depression, there's symptoms such as hallucination, depression, suicidal tendencies. And I read multiple stories of mothers who were going to kill, one of which who almost killed her children, who was hallucinating. And she even references Darlie dreaming about things, having these very lucid dreams leading up to the murder. I think she did kill her children. I think she was suffering a psychotic episode from postpartum depression. This is my theory. She murders her children. Her husband comes down, sees that she's murdered her children, knowing that she's not in a good way. And her husband then helps her cover up the murder. I think her husband grabbed a sock, picked up some things. That's why the sock had blood on it. And I think the reason why Darlie hasn't grassed out her husband is because her husband did everything he could to try to keep her out of prison, knowing that she had a bit of a mental breakdown. And there's medical professionals that'll say postpartum psychosis, even in those mothers that kill their children, they're sick people. They're people that when they, it's a psychotic episode. When they finish with that episode, they're distraught that they even did such a thing. They were committing acts that they thought were dreaming. I read one story about a woman who almost drove into a brick wall with her children, and then she came to reality. She thought she was dreaming, and she had to ask herself, am I dreaming or am I awake? And she felt like she had to drive her car into a wall. So I think she knows she did it. I think she had a psychotic episode. Now, I'm not saying this is 100% what happened, but this is my theory, and I think Darren helps her to cover it up unsuccessfully. That's my take. That's where I see this happening. I don't think there was an external third person involved.
I think that's a really interesting take, and there's a lot to recommend it. Based on the fact pattern, though, at least one question occurs to me. When does Darren plant that sock?
So when does Darren plant that sock? I mean, she's on the phone with 911. He's got plenty of opportunity to run out and run back in.
So you think that sometime while that call is going on, everything clicks in his... So you think he's woken up from a straight sleep, like he says. He comes downstairs, sees the scene, and very quickly, despite all the panic, I mean, because he undoubtedly, he talked about this, and I don't think I've never heard anyone question it. He attempted to administer CPR to one of the children. That failed, obviously.
That was when the police were there. So
okay.
So the Officer Waddle, he was the first responder. He was the one that saw Darren walking out of the house. Darren obviously went back in when the police were there, and he was giving CPR to his children at that stage. So the officer, I remember, it was very vivid because it's a very disturbing rendition, because he said he saw Darren giving CPR and Darlie just standing there not doing anything. And Darren was giving CPR and he could see blood coming out of the kid's chest because he had been stabbed. Yes. And he had a very vivid recollection of this. So this was while Darren was at the scene giving CPR. So
you think that while she's on the phone, in other words, Darren's running out of the house, planting a sock, has that presence of mind in the middle of all that.
Well, he's got this sock that he probably used to pick up a knife that she used, clean up her blood because maybe she tried to kill herself, put it back in the butcher block, and it's his sock. It is his tube sock, and it looks like it's been grabbed. He then realizes, I've got evidence of tampering here. I'm going to run down to that bin or that sewer, and I'm going to chuck it in, and I need to get my ass back in a hell of a hurry because she's on the phone with 911. And that's my best theory of what happened.
Could be. It could be.
Because there's a lot of the one thing that kept sticking to me was psychosis, and every body language expert I watched said that she had she was symptoms, I don't know if that's the right thing, but had indicators of being psychotic, which, with the way she interviews and the way she stares people down and how she reacts and how she checks with the camera when she's talking about, there's a detachment of emotion when she talks about her children. And how things are a bit forced and acted out. And it was just surprising, because when I looked up postpartum depression and infanticide and children murder, that just came up. It was like the Atlantic. I'll put that article in the description, and it was just like, wow, this to me seems like the most plausible thing with the evidence.
When this gets posted, we should put it in the comments, because that would be, along with the thing, so that people can read it. I mean, Darren is a suspicious character, there's no doubt. And I am certainly not above thinking he was involved in some way, and that perhaps he was involved in trying to cover up the crime. I mean, I think that does make a certain degree of sense. And if you think, in some ways it makes more sense than because if you think that Darlie was in the middle of some kind of, like, let's say, lucid dream or psychotic episode or some combination of those two things and attacked her children, then it explains a lot, right? It explains, certainly, for example, why she's still so hysterical and can maintain that hysteria on the phone, because she snapped out of something that she wasn't fully aware of. It certainly explains why there's no real sign of an intruder, despite the claims that there was one. That's part of, like, some kind of strange dream that she's having. But the problem with it is, on the other hand, there's a lot that it doesn't leave explained. One is the intruder story itself, because the intruder story that cuts both ways. Like, you could say, well, that was part of the dream, but if that's part of the dream, earlier you said you think that she knows she did it, but she's just, but it was a part of some sort of psychotic break. Well, if she knows she did it, she knows the intruder story is false. If she knows the intruder story is false, then there's more of a consciousness of guilt there than I would think of as somebody who's just sleepwalking. But in fact, there's a Forensic Files episode about a man who murdered his wife in a sleepwalking episode. And like, he did it without a doubt, but like, I'm trying to remember if he got off or not, but his defense was that he was sleepwalking, that he had no recollection of it whatsoever. And, he had experts who were willing to testify that, in fact, that this kind of thing is possible, and it does happen.
But that's not to say that I don't think she was, she came to. I think I think if my theory is true, I'm theorizing that the sound of her murdering her child woke up her husband and brought her back to reality, because it's a serious thing that you're doing, or the effort of trying to kill herself or whatever happened. Then her husband comes down, sees what happens. He knows she's not been well. There was reports of her being, in her room for multiple days, and he was getting stressed because he was having to do a lot of the work around the house and take care of the kids. So and this is his high school sweetheart. So he realizes she's not well. He then starts to, break shit very sloppily, throw flowers on the floor, say, listen, if anybody asks, somebody came in here and stabbed you and stabbed the kids.
My problem with that is that that's awfully calm and collected for what even for him would have been a pretty tight timeline. Because if he wakes up truly not knowing that this had occurred, he's got a little less time than she has to assess the situation, decide, oh crap, I've got to set this whole thing up, run outside, dump a sock, come back in, get the knife, and like, one thing I don't think that really fits with that at all is the screen being cut. Because if what you're saying is true, the screen would not have been cut. That had to be part of the cover up. And if she didn't do it, then Darren did it. And Darren did it in the same 4 minutes that he also, apparently went outside, dumped the sock, cleaned the knife, cleaned the sink. That's a lot to be doing in what must have been a state of shock.
It's more time than Darlie had, if we're saying that there wasn't an intruder. And it's not. I agree, it's unlikely, but it's not implausible that he thought, what has she done? Oh my God. Okay. Intruder, you need to call 911, break this, break that, grab a knife, go out the garage from the screen, after he's moved things with a sock, drop sock, run back, and then the sink's there.
I mean, Sean, imagine you woke up at 2:30 in the morning to the sounds of your wife screaming, and you found your dog butchered on the couch. Do you think that in 4 minutes you could cook that up?
No.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that it's not possible.
Doesn't mean that it's not possible.
We're talking about the preponderance of evidence says that, to me, it's not well, one, I don't think it's impossible for somebody to come to that conclusion. 75 yards down and back. For someone of his, let's say, limited fitness, can be done in, I don't know, let's say a minute 20, and then breaking.
If
the
it
crime
was just
scene
the
looked
sock,
haphazard,
and we were just the sock,
was doing while he was doing that as well.
If it were just the sock, I'd agree with you, but we also have to cut the screen.
That's on the way out. How hard is that? Zoom, zoom, out the door. We're not talking. We're not talking.
We have to wash the knife.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying, look, I'm not saying this has been something that's been litigated over for 20 years, and I'm not saying I've cracked the case. Yeah. However, this to me is the most plausible series of events, and I may not have every detail correct. But we also are working on, the crime scene that was investigated by, police who weren't as thorough as they probably could have been. And I'm not sure the full narrative that we have from the police is accurate as to what happened, the timelines and such. It just, to me, that's the most plausible thing I can think of, because I don't think there was a third person involved. I think you would have probably had somebody come clean or somebody caught. I don't think a burglar broke into the house, because people who rob don't want to kill, especially with knives, especially in Texas. Fuck, everybody.
Especially knives, what they did bring.
You get the Pizza Hut probably has an offer where you can get a gun with an extra, cheese or whatever.
Although an element of Darlie's defense, I was trying to track down if there was any updates on this. An element of her defense, at least as presented in the Unsolved Mystery segment, I don't know if it was presented at trial, was that there had been some crimes of a similar character in the Dallas area I think they're actually in Dallas proper. And so one thing, like, you know, I mean, I know that she was in quote unquote suburban Dallas, but you know, Dallas is a giant place. And so I don't have a great sense of how far Rowlett, Texas is from some of these crimes and whether or not, you know, this would have, there really could have been a connection. But there was supposedly someone who was breaking into homes and assaulting women with knives that they had found in the in the premises and while wearing a sock.
You're kidding me.
No, that was supposedly, you know, something, but I have not found anything to indicate whether or not that was solved or whether that was even really a thing. You know, it's just something that got floated.
So if that, so let's just say, assume that's true, then I don't think I've been hard enough on the police. Because I think again, you know, the willingness for them to run with the narrative that Darlie did it without thoroughly, even the idea that this was a police report, the police investigated a woman who had somebody try to break into her house on the night that Darlie had somebody quote break in and murder her children. And I think even in that police report, she said she saw a knife in the one's hand and they were wearing all black. You know, for me, it's like, how are you that confident to just sort of drop everything else and investigate Darlie Routier? I believe she's involved.
I don't think that's how police investigations work, though. I think that you start, like, you have some bodies, right? You start with an investigation. Well, you have to you start with the inner circle and you clear outwards, right? So who is in the home? Okay, we start with the husband. We've investigate the husband, we clear him. Now we start on the wife, and you keep working on the wife until you can clear her, and they never could clear her. And then ultimately they decided that her story didn't add up. And in fact, now, does that mean make it 100% so? It's an interesting question. And, you know, I began this by comparing it to Serial, and I think that was actually a relatively apt comparison, because as you follow that case, what becomes clear in that case is a very similar situation. Adnan Syed, in that case, there's a single witness who basically put him where he is, and it was his friend. And his friend turned state's evidence and gave the police everything they needed. And one of the things that he did was Hai-Min Lee, his girlfriend, her car was missing and no one could find it. And Jay, to prove that he was telling the truth and knew something, took the police to where Hai-Min's car had been found. So that, you know, they knew that he knew something of it, right? Like, there's no way for him to know where the car was unless he was somehow involved. And his story was that they had driven around in her car with her body in the trunk, and they ultimately buried her in a public park. But he, of course, his story was that his friend, the one he was turning evidence against, was in fact responsible for the murder. And in that case, Adnan Syed, he was the ex-boyfriend. He had all the motive to be the one who did it. And they had a witness who, the problem for the prosecution was, and the problem in that case is that witness, Jay, he can't tell that story the same way twice. He is not credible in so many ways, because every time he tells the story, there's a different thing. And he was interviewed recently after, I mean, the case happened almost 20 years. Now it is 20 years ago. He was interviewed somewhat recently when Serial became a hit, and he had yet another version of what had happened that night. You know, and it was always kind of shifting and changing, and now it was something completely different. I mean, not completely, but like a big element of it had changed. And you look at him, man, like, this guy can't tell the same story. So why, therefore, if he's so incredible, how is it that the jury can convict him? The problem is when you look at Adnan's story, every time you try to come up with some other plausible thing, it falls apart. It's not so much that it goes beyond a reasonable doubt, not because of any specific piece of physical or circumstantial evidence or eyewitness testimony that they have. It's that the group of it sort of surrounds Adnan, and there's an Adnan shaped hole in the center. You know what I mean? And I think that's what you have here. You have a Darlie Routier shaped hole in the center of this thing. Everything, the first narrative starts with her. You try to check it out. Things don't add up. And the only thing that's always at the center is hers. Even in your version, she's still principally responsible. Yeah. It mitigates the level of her responsibility. I agree that she probably shouldn't be on death row. But it's just hard to really cook up another plausible scenario where she is not primarily responsible.
I disagree. Now I don't disagree from the end result. I disagree from the perspective of the police at the investigation stage. So let me just compare these for you. Okay. So the first one, Darlie Routier. So let's look at the options here based on the evidence we have. And let's pretend that the police are looking at all angles, not just one. And I think we agree that the police laser focused on Darlie Routier.
Oh, they certainly did.
Routier. So let's take a look at Darlie. Okay, Darlie, criminal record, no. History of mental health. Now, let's forget about the postpartum depression because that's a fairly commonplace thing, for mothers. No criminal record. Character witnesses, neighbors loved them. Everybody who knew Darlie and Darren, yeah, great, happy couple. And I know there was some problems in their marriage, but people have that. No history of violence, normal. Wakes up in the middle of the night, murders her children out of nowhere. That's one option. Any physical evidence? No, but it's just very weird series of events. It looks like somebody covered something up. So we have some circumstantial evidence that, okay, fine. Okay, well, what else do we have? Well, we have somebody prowling the neighborhood who tried to break into a neighbor's house a couple blocks away, wearing all black with a knife. Okay. Whoa, that to me sounds a little bit more compelling to investigate than necessarily Darlie. Okay, well, what else? Her husband was going broke, and he did try to get somebody to break into the house for insurance money, and Darlie's life insurance is worth $250,000. Could he have hired? So yeah, he had a gun to his head at one point, threatened his wife to kill himself if she left. She was good. Okay, that to me sounds more credible than Darlie just flipping a switch one morning and killing. I appreciate this is counter to my narrative, by the way. But again,
I was going to say, you thought that's more
but I'm looking at
credible
this outside of myself. I'm looking at this from the perspective of the investigating team who are comparing which is the most likely option. And of those examples, they decided to just forget those other things and focus on Darlie, who, again, I agree. I appreciate there's some contradictory pieces in my story here, but I'm talking about the process of investigation. Does not sound like a sound process that they undertook. Granted, I think they got the right person, but it just absolutely astounds me that if I compare those narratives, I'm a bit more interested in some of the other ones than I am that Darlie, coming out of nowhere, just decided to murder her children.
I'm going to be somewhat self-contradictory here as well, because I think at the opening of the discussion, I think I said that there are some problems with whether or not we've reached the reasonable doubt threshold. And that's what I mean. That serial case is, again, an apt comparison because that's really the situation. I think it's actually a little bit more obvious in serial than Adnan. I just don't think there's another plausible candidate because either Jay or Adnan did it. Adnan says he didn't do it, but won't accuse Jay because in order to accuse Jay, he'd have to admit that he was more involved than he was. And so that leaves him up a creek without a paddle. And, so there you go. I think this is similar, but I think Darlie's just the nature of the case, the fact that there is no other witness, you are dealing only with, as you say, circumstantial evidence. Although I will point out, dumping on circumstantial evidence circumstantial is not any less valuable, even in pure legal terms.
The Supreme Court actually says circumstantial evidence is no different than physical evidence in a case. Yeah,
correct. So, and what you have here are circumstances where, Darlie has made a claim that is unsubstantiated and perhaps unsubstantiatable, which is the cleverness of it. It's not falsifiable. Yeah. Someone was here. Well, there's no evidence that someone was here, but that doesn't mean they weren't. You know what I mean? Like it's they can't falsify it. There's no apparent motive for someone to break in and take a somewhat lazy approach at killing the adult person on the couch, but take a very precise and brutal approach in killing the two children.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense for Darren to do it that way if the motive is financial. For the same reason that Darlie's own relatives are saying, well, it didn't make sense for her to do it for financial reasons. Well, the same logic applies to Darren. And you notice, I think it's telling that as much as Darlie's family is stumping for her innocence, they do not accuse or suggest that Darren is involved in any way. They're all in on the intruder theory.
No.
Well, I mean, but the problems with the intruder theory are, again, it's just not falsifiable. And it could be the case. And there are these fingerprints, but okay, where are they? You know what I mean? Turn them over. Let's run them against let's produce them. The fact that they have been turned over is problematic. The fact that an intruder has no apparent motive. I mean, the only motive that an intruder would have if it's not robbery, presumptively, is, to go after Darlie for reasons that we can imagine. But if that's the case, he utterly failed to do that.
But one thing, can I point out one thing though?
Right.
You're comparing a thorough process. So let's say there's 3 narratives that we say are somewhat plausible. Okay. Let's say 3, one of which is Darlie, one of which is external prowler, one of which is Darren hiring somebody. They spent 100% of their, let's even, I'll be generous and say 80% of their efforts on confirming Carly and 20% of their efforts gathering evidence on the other narratives. So we're comparing the totality of evidence on something they've worked a hell of a lot harder on than the 2 other avenues that they only questioned people and gave up on that. So we don't know to what degree they could have found substantial evidence if they had researched, okay, what cars were in the area? Who did they belong to? Oh, that was somebody who was arrested 2 weeks later for robbing and killing somebody with a sock on their hand. We don't know how far they could have taken those lines.
Does it strike you though that what you're telling me, if it's accurate, I didn't read about this prowler theory or the car in the neighborhood, but
and I didn't read about the hand sock guy in Dallas as well.
So, but I mean, all of this is very vague. The hand sock guy in Dallas is at least, presumptively there are other crimes that were committed, that there's some meat on that. But, I saw a strange car in the area.
But so let me ask the question.
There was a guy dressed in black trying to, I can't investigate that. What am I supposed to investigate?
Why can you not investigate cars that were driving around the area? Why can't you investigate police reports? Why can't you dig deeper into the description?
All right, Sean, there was a strange car in my neighborhood last night. Go ahead, investigate it.
Okay, I'm going to go to all the cameras that are in the area. I'm going to check all the gas
stations.
This is
1990. What was
97?
it? 6?
Well, yeah. Okay, so we're going to check all the gas stations. We're going to check all the police reports to see if there was any other robberies in the area, if there's any robberies in the last week or 2.
Okay, that takes 10 minutes.
Exactly. They didn't do that.
How do you know?
Because they said they only questioned her, and if you look in the case files, they questioned a witness who said that somebody was trying to break into their house a couple blocks away, and they didn't pursue it anymore. They just took a statement, and that was it.
Well, when you say they didn't pursue it, for all you know, they went and looked to see if there were any reported robberies in the area, and there weren't.
And, okay, to be fair, that's it. But it's you also from your. I think your perception that they investigated enough and my perception they investigated that enough are equally unfounded. And
you have a police department with limited resources. And again, like the process of any investigation, you start with the people who were at the scene and you move out from there once you've cleared the people at the scene. The problem for the police in this case is they couldn't clear the person who made the 911 call for good reason. Now, having said that, I also don't think it is strange that the evidence, while compelling, doesn't quite meet the threshold of falsity. What they needed to do was be able to show somehow definitively that the thing that she said happened didn't happen. And the problem is that there's just enough that I don't know that they got there. And it's hard to prove a negative.
Yeah.
Or they needed to be able to say, like, okay, here's, one of the children's blood all over the front of your shirt. Or inside your shirt, or some other thing that would be super. It was down to 1 drop of quote unquote cast off blood on the back of the shirt, and the fact that her wounds were superficial, that's circumstantial. There's no thing that you can point to and say, aha. And that's where we get down to the nature of reasonable doubt. And what does it really mean, reasonable doubt?
Do you think they investigated Darren Routier's calls and his dealings weeks leading up to that?
I don't know. And that at least I agree, perhaps maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but that would be one you'd want to exhaust.
I guess this is more to my point. And you make a really good point. And maybe I'm misunderstanding the investigative process. I just know that if I was, let's say I was Darren and I wanted, let's even say I'm the father, the grandfather or something. And I want to know who actually killed this person, these people. I would be really curious as to, okay, we have evidence that kind of says something, but it doesn't. We have this evidence based on a shit ton of work that's gone into it. And this is the best that we have. Okay. So what resource have we put into these other possibilities? Very little. Okay. So we're missing evidence that we don't have because we've not put the resource in to get that return. There's a specific return, part of discounting these other things, police officers, police departments can walk, as they say, I hate using these cliche terms because it's so now, walk and chew gum at the same time. They don't have to just focus on one. They have more than one person that can actually do a little bit more legwork on other pieces. And maybe that's something for the audience to ask. So maybe we ask in the comments, if you've made it this far, God damn it, you need to comment. If you've made it this far, do you think the Rowlett police did a thorough job in investigating. Do you think that they had reason to look at other options that were present, either prowlers in the area or Darren's dealings 2 weeks beforehand? Or do you think that actually because they couldn't discount Darlie, they were right in focusing as much resource they have into Darlie? So I'd be curious to hear what you think. And Andrew, that was a really interesting case. This is one of my favorite shows we've done so far, I think.
I think so. And I mean, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking even more things like, trying to work through a scenario where Darlie's not the center. So like, or she's equally at the center with Darren. So like, I'm thinking, well, maybe Darren, if he's willing to like investigate the possibility of bringing somebody in to rob the house in order to run an insurance scam, maybe he'd take that one step further and have them come in and murder the kids.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that actually means there is a third party involved, and maybe like except the problem with that is if that's the plan, you're either cooking it up with your wife. And again, then the plan is what? You're going to split $10,000 worth of insurance money. Apparently they needed a $5,000 loan. You need every cent of that insurance money. You can't be splitting it with anybody. So that doesn't really make much sense. The only way it makes sense is like if Darren did it on his own and hired this person, said, listen, come in and kill my wife. And for some reason he butchered the 2 children and didn't manage to kill the wife. And if I'm Darren, boy, am I pissed. You know what I mean? Like, neither one of those makes a lot of sense. But yes, anyway, I do think, and this has been one of the better episodes. And again, and it's been fun to discuss. I think that this really does get down to, for me, I've never sat on a jury, and I've always wondered and asked myself, what is reasonable doubt? Like when I'm sitting in that box and I'm finally asked to render a decision, what does that mean? Does it mean I'm 90% sure? Does it mean I'm 95% sure? Does the target move depending on the severity of the charge? It's kind of what I've always thought. Like, gee, if I'm there sitting but even sending somebody to jail, you're ruining their life, even if it's only for, like 6 months because of some, like, whatever, that's going to be on their record forever. Yeah. And, it's so hard to know, you know what I mean? And like, how does one construct knowledge without direct knowledge? It's a fascinating case.
And that's that for me. And I think that's a good way to sign off on that. Cause I think you and I, the one thing we 100% agree on is, and maybe, I don't know if we would act differently if I've never been on a jury either. Knowing what I've learned, and let's assume that I've, got everything that they've gotten on the jury. I just don't see anything that would give me any sort of confidence to say, yeah, I'm going to put my vote for guilty, because I just don't have that assurance to damn somebody. Right. And the people in the jury, and no disrespect, but I really disagree with the idea that I look at a video of somebody smiling 8 days after a funeral, because, again, personal incredulity is not a reason to commit somebody to death. And because you can't comprehend how somebody who may very well be a psychopath, which doesn't mean you're a murderer, you can be a psychopath and not murder anybody. But if Darlie's a psychopath, it doesn't make her a murderer. And it's just not possible to commit her to death based on that video alone.
I agree, and I've always agreed about that. I think it should not have been admitted. I don't think it has no evidentiary value, like I said in the first episode. I think that the prosecution did a smart thing. They moved the venue to a place where they could sell the particular narrative they were selling. Worldly mother, more interested in material goods and not like, the image of the saintly mother that conservative Christian communities like. Is responsible for the deaths of her children, and here we have this video to show what a callous monster she was. And I think that that's what they sold. I agree that if I were in that jury box, I don't know that I could have voted guilty. I think that they did fail to meet the burden of proof. However, I think it's much more probable than not that she did it. I'm really right on the razor's edge here, because it is like, it feels like that Adnan Syed thing. There's a Darlie Routier shaped hole in the center of this case. And every time I try to come up with an alternative, the alternative doesn't make a lot of sense, except if if it happened exactly as she said. And it's crazy, but it just this side of plausible that it happened. And with that in mind, I think that I'm just short of being able to convict.
Well, to everybody, thanks for sticking around this long. I sadly don't think, I was hoping that at the end of this, we would have actually solved the case. And this we would have gotten a lot of notoriety for it. We would have saved a person's life, or given closure, but I don't think that's happened today. For everybody watching this, we do have a few things sort of, we are sticking along the lines of true crime. And if you see a case that you want us to talk about, I've created a Discord server. Now, I'm going to show my age at 43, and I kind of understand how they work. If you know how they work, please comment. But we want to start using that Discord server as a place where people can get on and start talking about cases and even speak with us when we're not recording, and help us sort of put together these shows for the coming weeks. And I think it's my turn next. So we're going to be airing this over the course of 3 weeks, which gives Dixon, you and I, some time to plan our next show. So again, if you have anything, let us know. Andrew, let's talk at some point this week on what our next one's going to be. I have a few ideas I'm going to bounce off you.
Sounds good.
All
right. See everybody in a few weeks.
Yeah. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.